Good afternoon. A lot of researchers over the last 10 years or so have been telling us that the church is failing to retain young people. Both secular and Christian researchers are saying that though young people have always sort of drifted away from the church when they were in their 20s, they tended to come back when they get married and have kids, and now the evidence is showing that that's not the case. Probably the most startling research was done by the Southern Baptists, the largest Protestant denomination in the United States, when they found that they're not even keeping up with the birth rate in their own churches anymore. So it's a wake-up call. What's going on with these young people? For me, it became more than statistical when a few years ago I left my full-time role at my church, but I kind of kept my pastoral ministry going by meeting with college students. These were all students who had grown up in Christian homes, gone to Christian churches, they were at a Christian college. And yet, repeatedly, they would talk to me about how they were deeply struggling with their faith. They didn't feel the church was relevant or important, and they came to me looking for some kind of guidance on what to do. And as I met with them, and I heard their stories and started poking around at what they believed and what they thought, I could only come to one conclusion, which was by spending 18 or 20 years in the church, these young people had actually been inoculated to the gospel. Someone challenged me a couple years ago when we were having some issues at our church and we were trying to figure out what was going on, and he simply said, have you ever considered that maybe your system is perfectly designed to produce the results you are experiencing? That it's not an anomaly or an accident that you're seeing these results, but actually the very system is designed to do this. So the hard thing I have to say to you today is I am convinced that the majority of churches in North America are actually designed to inoculate people to the gospel. And here's why. All human religion is predicated on one thing, whether you're talking about Christianity, Islam, Hinduism, doesn't matter. It's all predicated on one thing, and that is that we all share a dangerous world. And sooner or later, we experience the fact that this is a dangerous world, and when we do, we all respond the same way. We all become afraid. And in our fear, we want to protect ourselves. We want to gain some level of assurance that we're going to be okay. And so the way we respond to our fear is we seek control. It comes in many different forms. But we all want to protect ourselves from the chaos, the ugliness, the injustice, the scarcity of our world. But here's the problem. The more we try to control our circumstances in our world, ironically, it leads to a more dangerous planet. In order for me or my community to have enough oil, water, food, whatever, land, I usually have to take it away from someone else, which causes conflict. And around we go. Danger, fear, control. All human religion is a system of control predicated on fear. Religion, in its essence, was designed in order to protect us from the dangerous world by somehow getting control over it, including most forms of Christianity. Now, in the popular American church, the way we try to control God comes in 4 different postures, as I call them. I want to walk through them with you and show you how this gets taught to young people, how it ultimately fails to satisfy their deepest longings, and why then they walk away from the church. So the first posture, by far the most common throughout all human history and religions, is what I call life under God. God represented by the triangle. Life under God simply says this: the world is a dangerous, uncontrollable place, and the best way to gain control over the world is to try to control the God who created the world. And the way you control God is by one of 2 things, either through rituals or through morality. So you throw a virgin down the volcano to make sure there's going to be a good harvest next year. Or you say the right incantations, the right prayers, you give the right amount of money, and God will bless you. Or more modern forms of religion, it's through morality. You know, you keep your sexual ethics within certain boundaries, God will bless you. You do this, go to church, God will bless you. So in a weird way, life under God is really like being a puppet master, where we have these strings, morality, rituals, that we try to control God, and through controlling God, we control the world around us. But we're setting our young people up for failure if this is the way we teach them to think about God, because one of 2 things is going to happen. Either they will very successfully adhere to all the rules and regulations that we tell them God expects them to follow, but then God notoriously is uncooperative with our attempts at controlling him. So they do everything right, and life is still hard, or they don't get into the Ivy League school, or their girlfriend breaks up with them, and the only conclusion they can draw is Christianity is a sham. It didn't work. Or what more likely is going to happen is young people are not going to be able to perfectly adhere to the moral expectations that we teach them in the churches. And then they conclude, if I can't be a moral person as defined by the church, I can't be a Christian. And so they walk away. That's life under God. And notice, it's really all about control, predicated on fear. The world's dangerous. I'm going to try to control God by controlling the world, and it does not deliver us from this cycle. So the second option, the one that our modern world has opted for in many ways, is not life under God, but life over God. Life over God basically said, you don't need to follow divine commandments or rituals or moralities to get control of the world. Science has taught us that you can take direct control over the world. That puppet masterpiece, you can essentially just cut God out of the equation. Take direct control through laws and principles, through science, through technology, and God can just be put off to the side. Now, the most extreme version of this is atheism, right? God doesn't exist at all. Take direct control over your world. You're in control. But there's a Christian variety of this as well. In the Christian variety, it says, hey, the reason why your life isn't going so well is because the laws and principles that you're using to guide your life, you're taking from, Oprah Winfrey or from some secular guru. And what you really need to do is get your laws and principles for governing your life from Scripture. The Bible, people call it the divine manual for the human being or the basic instructions before leaving Earth. The Bible can give you direct control through principles and laws. And so we teach people how to have a relationship with the Bible, but they may not ever have a relationship with the God of the Bible. This was the problem with the Pharisees. Jesus says to them in John chapter 5, you search the Scriptures because in them you think you will find life. And yet these are the Scriptures that testify about me, and yet you do not come to me. You can have a relationship with the Scriptures and not a relationship with God. You can put God off to the side. You can come to church and thank Him for giving you the divine principles to run your life, but you don't actually need Him to be directly involved. And what we end up doing is saying it's a dangerous world that we're afraid of. Get control of it yourself through the Bible, and we remain in control completely. And sooner or later, it doesn't work. And it still falls apart. I raised my kids based on biblical principles. I followed God's advice for money and finances. I'm still in debt, my kid's still a jerk, and my husband's still leaving me. What's going on? Because that's not Christianity. It's Christian deism. So, life under God, life over God. Then the most popular, by far, in our contemporary Christian environment is what I call life from God. What this one says is that the essence of life is unmet desires. And everything and everyone in the universe exists to satisfy my needs and my desires. It's consumerism. Consumer is king. Everything revolves around me. And when you bring that worldview into Christianity, you can quickly believe that God exists to satisfy me, my needs, my desires. Now, there's an element of truth to this. God does give us what we need, everything for life. He is our provider. He tells us to ask Him for the things that we need. He is our Heavenly Father from whom comes every good and perfect gift. But this view sees God one-dimensionally. He exists solely to satisfy my needs and desires. We make Him into a divine vending machine. You have a need? The problem is you're going about the wrong way of getting it met. You need to ask God for it. In its most extreme versions, this becomes the health and wealth gospel, a prosperity gospel. But God exists to serve me. Research has been done that shows that this is the faith held by most American teenagers in the church. They call it MTD, moralistic therapeutic deism. And the researcher concluded that most of these teenagers view God as either a divine butler or a cosmic therapist who exists to satisfy their needs and desires. And then when He invariably doesn't satisfy their consumeristic desires, they walk away. What have you done for me lately? The best biblical example of this is the story of the prodigal son in Luke chapter 15. If you remember that story, this younger son goes to his wealthy father, tells him to drop dead, I want my part of the inheritance now, and he goes off to a distant country to spend it on wild living. And it's evident from that story that the son doesn't actually want a relationship with his father. He just wants his father's stuff. If you want to have a very large, successful ministry, it's very easy. All you do is ask people, what do you want? And then you tell them that God is how you get it. consumer Christianity, life from God. Now, this has become an epidemic in American Christianity, and so the way we've responded to it in the last number of years, including with our young people, is to simply reverse it. So we go from life from God, and then we teach them, no, no, no. The essence of Christianity is life for God. It puts mission at the center of the Christian faith. Now, this is where pastors start getting really uncomfortable. What we tell them is, no, God doesn't exist to serve you. You exist to serve God. And the essence of the Christian life is figuring out what God's purpose is in the world and then get on mission for Him. And the way you can make yourself not feel afraid in this world, especially the fear of insignificance, is to do more for God. And the more you can accomplish for God, the better you can feel about yourself. And the better you can feel about your place in this world and protect yourself from the dangers within it. Now, this is I saw among the young people that I was counseling. One night we were all together. They wanted to talk about the presence of sin in their lives, the ongoing presence of sin. And I said, okay, I don't want to hear what your stuff is because it's probably not appropriate in this setting. Instead, I want to go around the table and answer this question for me. In the midst of my sin, how does God view me? It took about an hour. We went around the table. And one by one, these young people shared essentially the same thing. God is supremely disappointed with me because of my ongoing struggle with whatever it is. Some of them were in tears. Finally gets back around to me, and I asked them, how many of you grew up in a Christian home? They all raised their hand. How many of you grew up in a Bible-centered church? They all raised their hand. Half the kids there grew up as missionary kids overseas. And I said, this is astonishing. You've all grown up with the Bible taught to you since you were in diapers, and not one of you gave the right answer. Not a single one of you said that in the midst of my sin, God still loves me. It wasn't even on their radar, because this had been drilled into them their whole life, implicitly or explicitly in the church, that what matters most about you is what you do for God. And if you have sin in your life, the problem is you can't do more for God until you get rid of that sin. That was the lens they saw themselves through. So rather than freeing them from a cycle of fear and control and danger, it made them feel more afraid, more insecure, seeking more control. I got to accomplish more. I got to dig wells in Africa. I got to end poverty. I got to feed the homeless. I got to end sex trafficking. They're this activist generation that's driven, and a lot of that's good, but the problem is in the church, so many of them are driven to activism, not truly out of compassion. They're driven to activism because they're searching for significance. And they believe that their value and significance is rooted in how much they accomplish. And when they get burned out on mission or activism, they walk out of the church. So what do? These are the four dominant postures of American Christianity: life under God, life over God, life from God, and life for God. None of them are the bullseye of what Jesus actually taught. Let me go back to that prodigal son story. The younger son walks away, life from God, just wants his dad's stuff, doesn't want a relationship with his father. Remember the other son in the story? The older brother? He's ticked when his brother comes back and the dad throws a party for him. He's out in the field having a pity party by himself. Father comes out to meet with him. And the older brother says to his dad, hey, all these years I've served you, but you never gave me a party. Yet this idiot son of yours comes back and you kill the fattened calf for him. What's up? The older son was living this way. Look at all that I've done for you. But the father's response in Luke 15, verse 31 is amazing. The father says to him, son, all these years you have been with me. And all I have is yours. But this brother of yours was lost and is found. He was dead and is alive again. What the father is saying there is, the most important thing has not been your obedience. It's appreciated, but it's not what's most important. And the most important thing is not your brother's disobedience. That will be dealt with, but it's not the ultimate thing. What's most important is my children's presence. You have always been with me. This is the gospel that Jesus came to teach us. That the essence of our life in relation to God is not over, under, from, or forward, though there's a grain of truth to each of them. But the essence of the Christian life is life with God. The big difference between life with God and all the other postures is every other posture tries to use God to achieve some other end. God is how I get control over the world in order to protect myself from fear and danger. God is how I accumulate enough wealth and health in the world. God is how I get a sense of significance by being on mission for Him. God is always the how. But what Jesus taught is that He's not just the way. He's also the life. Jesus said that God is more valuable than anything else. And those who see Him clearly recognize He's not just how I get my treasure. God is the treasure. Jesus did not come just to die and rise again. He lived a perfect life. Why? Because He is the image of the invisible God, in whom all the presence of God was pleased to dwell. He lived and dwelt among us so that He might reveal the truth of who God is. And the way John summarized Jesus' teaching is this, that God is light, and in Him is no darkness at all. And when people get a clear vision of who God is, something happens. They no longer just want to use God. They actually want God. That's the essence of life with God. We must want Him. But once we want Him, then the way must be open, and that's where the cross comes into play. John Piper has this amazing quote that we really need to wrestle with. He says, "The gospel is not how people get to heaven. The gospel is how people get to God. And if you would be happy in heaven if Jesus were not there, you will not be there." The gospel is not how people get to heaven, it's how they get to God. The question is, and this is the question we need to be asking regarding our young people, do they want God? We might lure them in by promises of this will make your life better, this will make your marriage better, this will make your schooling better, this will give you a sense of significance and purpose. That's not the gospel. The question is, do they want God? The primary purpose of the church, before mission, before healing, before transforming the culture, the first purpose of the church is to give a ravishing vision of who Jesus Christ is and let Him draw people to Himself. But we are not presenting Jesus Christ, we're presenting mission, or we're presenting transformation, or we're presenting healthy marriage or family, and so people come for a reason other than Jesus Himself. And we keep them stuck in this cycle and then wonder why people leave. But when they do get a ravishing vision of who Jesus is, something happens right here. In our fear, we can choose to surrender to the perfect God who loves us and will never let us go. And then, once we surrender, we discover that faith is possible. I can actually do what He's called me to do. And when I begin to follow Him, I realize this is not a dangerous world. I'm perfectly safe in this universe. Nothing can snatch me from His hand. I can turn the other cheek. I can walk the second mile. I can even pick up my cross and deny myself, because not even death can take me away from my God. And suddenly, we are living a life with God in freedom and faith and hope and love. Until we get the gospel right, we shouldn't be surprised that young people are walking away. What we should be surprised is the few that stay. We've got to begin giving our world a ravishing vision of who God is and calling them to Him first. I'll end with this. Before we are called to something, before we are called to somewhere, we are first called to someone. Thank you.
Thanks, Skye. As we were talking last night, one of the things I remember that when you had spoken before at another conference was about this notion of a safe house, where you're meeting with these kids in a Christian school, and they're not having the safety to talk at all. It was this really interesting. In fact, it's going to come up tonight in my message as I'm teaching tonight in the chapel, just about there's this sort of inability to be authentic with each other. That there's a fear about what happens when we're authentic with each other. There's this, so there then needed to be a place where people could talk about the things of their own faith. And you hosted that, and I'm just curious, what were some of the, as you began to talk with them, What are some of the major themes that you saw? You mentioned it a little bit in your talk already, but what are some of the things that you thought, gosh, this is a cause for the reason why you have this kind of loneliness? What sort of, like maybe that broke your heart as you kind of heard their stories too?
I mean, when you go back to those 4 false postures, if they've been told that Christianity is really about your morality and you're failing in that area, it's very hard to open up about it. Or if it's all about mission and what you're achieving and you feel like you're not achieving much, it's hard to open up about it. But if you really get at the essence of Christianity, the funny thing is we talk about this all the time. It's a personal relationship with Jesus Christ. It is. But that's not actually what we're communicating in our communities. So when you build it all on morality or mission or Bible or whatever it is, and people are struggling in that area, they tend not to open up about it. But then when you give them the reality that, hey, you can struggle sexually and be a Christian, then, oh, I can talk about this now because my whole identity isn't being put out in front of people to be destroyed.
Yeah. When you talk, because this has been going on for a while, this safe house kind of experience. Was there, do you have the experience of some of those kids, I'm assuming, college kids going from this sort of, the 4 postures you talked about and then moving into this sort of with posture with Jesus? What tended to be the preceding events? What kind of conversations did they go, I missed out on something here?
Yeah, well, I definitely find that some students are ready for it, some are not. So the group ends up becoming a self-selecting group. There's some students who come who this does not register. They're totally invested in one of those other postures. They're not ready to hear it. But what I found is it's those students who are at the end of their rope, who are ready to walk away from the church and the faith entirely, who are finally ready to actually come to Jesus. And when they get it straight, when they hear the message clearly, and when they experience him in a culture or in a community that isn't rooted in one of these other postures, they come alive. So they just have to be at the right spot for it.
So in general, it's sort of the crisis that sort of sends people to this place.
Yeah.
Wow.
And unfortunately, I wish it wasn't that.
Right.
I mean, if we got him earlier and we start really building our churches and communities around the relationship component of the gospel rather than these other postures, including mission, I think they wouldn't have to go through that rock bottom kind of thing before they bounce back.
So in essence, what you're saying, to make sure you can correct me if I'm not saying this right, those are people who really are becoming Christians in that moment.
Yeah. And
up until that point, they've had this sort of false or,
Yeah, and I don't think there's anything unique about this generation. I think the difference is I've been in all 5 of those postures at one point or another. Most of us probably recognize, oh yeah, I lived this way or that way. The difference is when we end up feeling dissatisfied in our faith, at least prior generations, we stuck with the church because there was a cultural expectation that you did that.
Right.
When this generation realizes Christianity is a sham and it ain't working for me, they don't stay in the church. They walk. So when I talk about this in certain environments, a lot of people who, lifelong pastors, 34 years going, yeah, I just have been scared to say this.
Right.
Or I've been in the church for 20 years and I feel this way, but you're invested, you don't leave. If you're 18, who cares, right? You walk. So this is not just for the young generation. This is for everybody. And like I said, I feel like our churches are actually inoculating people because they're so invested in one of those other postures that people think they've received the real gospel, and then they find it powerless, and they walk away. And they've been inoculated.
If you could prescribe, if you had control over all churches in the world and could say, this is what I want to have. These are, this is something that has to happen to refocus people. Like you said, the ravishing picture of Jesus.
Yeah.
What would be the first thing you would either do away with or add to the churches? I realize I just gave you a huge amount of power, so enjoy it.
I'll do 2 things. Number one, I genuinely believe that it comes down to leadership. If the people who are leading our churches are not in this posture of communion with God, but really driven by mission or vision or whatever it is, they're going to transfer that onto the people they lead, and it goes round and round. So it really comes to the church leaders themselves coming to a freedom and wholeness in the gospel before they can lead their people there. But secondly, I know I've been talking so negatively about the church. I think the church is actually doing just fine.
Good. I think we're all holding our breath waiting for you to say that.
But here's what I mean. When we use the word church, it comes 4 different ways. We either mean a building, an event, an organization, or the community of men, women, and children who've been regenerated by God.
Right.
Buildings are going to come and go. Events, some are terrible, some are great. Organizations, most of them I think are a total mess. The Church of Jesus Christ in this world is doing just fine.
Eternal.
So the problem is many of us who are invested in the organizations should be supporting the Church of Jesus Christ. I think many of our organizations are actually hurting it.
Interesting.
So,
yeah. Cool. Thanks, Skye.
Yeah.
Really much appreciate it. All of Skye's stuff, you want to check out some of his books. They're out at the table out there. Make sure you also follow him on Twitter, Skye_. That's kind of underscored. Oh, I guess we need this too.